The first time Hayes Ryder heard Beatrice Walsh speak, her voice already sounded like autumn leaves crumbling in the wind, and he knew without being told that he was listening to something precious slipping away. It was late September in 1878, and the evening sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Redding, California. Hayes had ridden into town that afternoon with nothing but his horse, a battered saddle, and the kind of weariness that comes from drifting too long without purpose. He had been a ranch hand, a cattle driver, a tracker, and a dozen other things since the war ended, but none of it had ever felt like home. At 26, he figured he had seen enough of the frontier to know that permanence was a myth men told themselves to sleep better at night. The saloon was called the Golden Prospect, named optimistically during the mining rush that had brought the railroad and brief prosperity to this corner of Shasta County. Hayes pushed through the doors expecting the usual scene: tired miners, card games, watered-down whiskey, and maybe a piano player if the establishment had pretensions. What he found instead was silence, and a crowd of rough men sitting perfectly still, their attention fixed on a woman standing near the fireplace. She was not what he expected. Beatrice Walsh stood perhaps 5 feet and 4 inches tall, slender as a willow branch, with dark hair pinned up in a simple style that had come slightly loose throughout what he would learn had been hours of talking. She wore a plain gray dress with a white collar, respectable and modest, the kind of thing a schoolteacher might wear. Her face was pale, almost translucent in the lamplight, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that burned with an intensity that seemed at odds with the fragility of her frame. She looked to be in her early 20s, though illness had carved small lines around her mouth that made it hard to tell for certain. Hayes found an empty spot at the bar and signaled for a drink, but the bartender shook his head and put a finger to his lips. The woman was speaking, her voice barely above a whisper, yet somehow carrying to every corner of the room. And so the princess found herself at the edge of the enchanted forest, Beatrice was saying, each word carefully measured as if speaking cost her dearly, where the trees grew so thick that sunlight became a memory and shadows took on lives of their own. Hayes realized with some surprise that she was telling a fairy tale, the kind of story mothers told children before bed. Yet every man in that saloon sat riveted, and when he looked closer at their faces, he understood why. These were men who worked themselves to exhaustion in the mines and on the ranches, men who rarely spoke of anything softer than whiskey and wages. In Beatrice's stories, they found something they had forgotten existed. She continued the tale for another 20 minutes, her voice growing progressively hoarser until the final words came out as barely more than breath. When she finished, the silence held for a long moment before someone started clapping, and then the whole room erupted in applause, and the clink of coins being tossed into a hat that sat on a small table beside her. Beatrice nodded her thanks but did not smile. She pressed a hand to her throat, and Hayes saw her wince. Then she gathered the hat full of coins, whispered something to the bartender, and made her way toward the back door of the saloon. Hayes found himself standing without quite deciding to do so. He left his untouched drink on the bar and followed her outside into the cooling evening air. She was leaning against the wall of the building, her eyes closed, and her chest rising and falling with the effort of catching her breath. Up close, Hayes could see the flush of fever on her cheeks and the tremor in her hands. "Madam," he said softly, not wanting to startle her, "are you all right?" Beatrice opened her eyes and looked at him with an expression that was neither surprised nor particularly welcoming. "I am managing," she said, her damaged voice even more pronounced now that she was not projecting it to an audience. "Thank you for your concern." "That was quite a performance in there," Hayes said, uncertain why he was prolonging the conversation except that something about her pulled at him. "I have never seen anything quite like it." "It is what I do," Beatrice said simply. She pushed herself away from the wall, steadying herself with one hand. "Or what I did. What I am trying to do for as long as I am able." The frankness of the statement caught Hayes off guard. "You are sick." "Consumption," Beatrice said, the word falling between them like a stone into still water. "The doctor in Sacramento gave me 6 months. That was 4 months ago." Hayes felt something tighten in his chest. He had seen consumption before, had watched it hollow out strong men and leave them as fragile as dried corn husks. The fact that this woman was standing here telling stories instead of lying in a sick spoke to a will he could only begin to imagine. "Why stories?" he asked. For the first time, something like a smile touched Beatrice's lips. "Why anything?" she replied. "I was a school teacher before the coughing started. I loved teaching children their letters, watching them discover that words could open worlds. When I became too ill to teach, I thought that was the end. But then I discovered that adults need stories too, perhaps even more than children. So I tell them. I travel from town to town and I tell stories until my voice gives out and then I move on." "That sounds lonely," Hayes said. "It is," Beatrice agreed. "But it is also necessary. I have so many stories left in me, you see. I need to tell them before they die with me." Hayes understood something in that moment, though he could not have put it into words. He understood that this woman was racing against her own mortality, trying to empty herself of all the tales she carried before the consumption stole her breath forever. It was the saddest and bravest thing he had ever encountered. "My name is Hayes Ryder," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I am new to Reading, and I expect I will be here for a while. If you are staying in town, I would like to hear more of your stories." Beatrice studied him for a long moment, and Hayes had the uncomfortable sensation of being read like one of the tales she told. Whatever she saw in him must have been acceptable, because she nodded slightly. "Beatrice Walsh," she said. "And yes, I will be here for perhaps another week. The owner of the saloon has offered me room and board in exchange for nightly performances. You are welcome to listen, Mr. Ryder." "Hayes," he corrected. "Just Hayes." "Very well, just Hayes," Beatrice said, and this time her smile was genuine if fleeting. "I should rest now. Tomorrow evening, if you are interested, I will tell the story of the wandering knight and the tower made of starlight." She moved past him, walking with careful steps back toward the front of the building where, Hayes assumed, she had lodgings. He stood in the alley alone, watching her go, and felt something shift inside him that he could not quite name. That night, lying in a rented room above the general store, Hayes found himself thinking about Beatrice Walsh and her dying voice. He had drifted for so long, moving from place to place without attachment or purpose. His father had died in the war when Hayes was barely 15, and his mother had followed 2 years later from a fever, leaving him alone in a world that seemed to have no particular use for him. He had worked hard jobs and easy ones, had saved money and lost it, had bedded women whose names he forgot within a week. Nothing had stuck. Nothing had mattered enough to make him want to stay in one place. But something about Beatrice had lodged itself under his skin like a splinter, small and sharp and impossible to ignore. The next evening, Hayes was the first person through the doors of the Golden Prospect. He took a seat near the fireplace where Beatrice would stand and waited. The saloon filled gradually as the sun set, miners and ranch hands and shopkeepers all finding their way to hear the storyteller. There was an unspoken reverence in the way they settled into their seats, as if they were entering a church rather than a drinking establishment. Beatrice appeared precisely at 7 o'clock, looking even more fragile than she had the night before. Her dress was a different one, dark blue this time, but just as modest and neat. She acknowledged the crowd with a small nod and then began without preamble. The story she told was about a knight who had been cursed to wander the world unable to rest or die, until he found the one thing he had lost in a moment of cowardice. His travels took him through kingdoms of ice and deserts of glass, across oceans that sang and mountains that wept. Each place he visited, he performed acts of courage and kindness, trying to atone for whatever failing had cursed him. But nothing lifted the curse, and he grew weary beyond measure. Beatrice's voice cracked and faltered throughout the telling, yet this only seemed to make the story more powerful. When she described the knight's exhaustion, Hayes heard it in every rasping breath she took. When she spoke of his loneliness, he saw it in the shadows under her eyes. Finally, in Beatrice's tale, the knight came to a tower made entirely of captured starlight, beautiful and impossible. At the top of the tower lived a woman who had been imprisoned there by a jealous sorcerer. The knight climbed the tower, not because he thought the woman was what he had lost, but simply because climbing was what he did, and saving people had become his habit. When he reached the top, the woman looked at him and said, "You have been searching for your courage, but you lost it when you walked away from love. I am not your lost courage, knight, but perhaps I could be your found love if you are willing to stop searching and start living." The curse broke. The knight, who had wandered for 100 years, finally found rest. Not because he had recovered what he lost, but because he had discovered something new. When Beatrice finished, her voice was barely a whisper. She touched her throat gingerly and then sat down hard on a nearby chair, as if her legs would no longer hold her. The applause was thunderous, but she barely seemed to hear it. Hayes watched as she closed her eyes and concentrated on breathing. He waited until the crowd had dispersed and the coins had been collected before approaching her. "That was beautiful," he said. Beatrice opened her eyes. Recognition flickered across her face. "Just Hayes," she said. "You came back. I said I would." Hayes hesitated, then pulled up a chair and sat across from her. "Can I ask you something?" "You may ask. I may not answer." "Do you write these stories down so they will not be lost when—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "When I die," Beatrice finished for him. Her bluntness was almost shocking. "No, I cannot write them anymore. My hands shake too much, and the effort of writing exhausts me in a way that speaking somehow does not. The stories live in my voice, and when my voice dies, they will die too." "That seems wrong," Hayes said. "Wasteful." "Perhaps," Beatrice agreed. "But it is the truth of things. I have made my peace with it." Hayes did not think she had made peace with anything. He thought she was furious and heartbroken and fighting with every breath she had left. But he did not say this. Instead, he said, "Would you like some company? For dinner, I mean. The hotel down the street serves a decent stew and you look like you could use a meal." Beatrice studied him again with that unsettling directness. "Why?" she asked. "Why what?" "Why are you interested in spending time with a dying woman you just met?" Hayes considered the question. He could have offered platitudes or dodged the truth, but Beatrice's honesty seemed to demand his own. "I do not know exactly," he admitted. "But I have been drifting for a long time without anything to hold on to. Your stories make me feel like I am part of something larger than myself, and you seem like you could use a friend." "I do not need pity," Beatrice said, her voice sharpening despite its weakness. "I am not offering pity," Hayes replied. "I am offering companionship. There is a difference." They looked at each other for a long moment, and then Beatrice nodded slowly. "Very well. Dinner, but you should know that I am not particularly good company. I tire easily, and I am often in pain, and I have little patience for small talk." "Noted," Hayes said. He stood and offered her his arm, After a moment's hesitation, Beatrice took it and allowed him to help her to her feet. The hotel restaurant was quiet at this hour, most of the supper crowd having already eaten and departed. Hayes and Beatrice took a table near the window, where they could watch the last light fade from the sky. Hayes ordered stew for both of them and coffee, though Beatrice asked for tea instead. "Coffee is too harsh on my throat," she explained. As they waited for the food, Hayes asked, "How did you become a storyteller? I mean, I know you said you were a teacher, but there must be more to it than that." Beatrice wrapped her hands around her teacup, clearly savoring the warmth. "My father was a newspaperman in San Francisco," she said. "He loved stories in all their forms, news and fiction and gossip and history. He used to tell me that stories were how human beings made sense of chaos. Every night before bed, he would tell me tales, sometimes ones he remembered from his own childhood, sometimes ones he made up on the spot. I fell in love with the rhythm of narrative, the way a good story could transport you somewhere entirely different from where you were sitting." "And your mother?" Hayes asked. A shadow passed over Beatrice's face. "She died when I was very young, cholera. I barely remember her, honestly. It was always just my father and me. He made sure I was educated, which was unusual for a girl, but he believed that minds had no gender. I learned to read and write and do mathematics. I studied literature and history, and I learned that I loved teaching, loved passing on stories and knowledge to others. What happened to your father? He died 3 years ago. Heart failure. It was sudden and shocking, and I was alone." Beatrice took a sip of her tea. "I continued teaching, but about a year after his death, I started coughing. At first, I thought it was just a bad cold. Then it did not go away. Then I started coughing up blood. The doctor confirmed what I already suspected." Hayes felt a wave of sympathy so strong it almost hurt. "I am sorry." "We are all sorry about something," Beatrice said. "The trick is deciding what to do with the time we have left. I chose stories. I chose to wander and tell tales and try to leave something of beauty behind me." The food arrived, and they ate in companionable silence for a while. Hayes noticed that Beatrice ate very little, picking at her stew as if the act of swallowing required too much effort, but she seemed grateful for the warmth and the company. "What about you?" Beatrice asked eventually. "What is your story, just Hayes?" Hayes shrugged. "Nothing as interesting as yours. I grew up on a small farm in Missouri. My father went off to fight in the war and never came back. My mother tried to keep the farm going, but she did not have the strength or the help. She died when I was 17. I sold the land for barely anything and headed west. I have been moving ever since." "What are you looking for?" Beatrice asked. It was the same question Hayes had been asking himself for nearly a decade. "I do not know," he admitted. "Purpose, maybe. A reason to stop moving. I keep thinking that if I go far enough or work hard enough, I will find something that makes me want to stay in one place, but it has not happened yet." "Perhaps you are like the wandering knight," Beatrice said softly. "Searching for something you lost without realizing that what you need is right in front of you." Hayes met her eyes and felt something electric pass between them. "Perhaps," he said. They finished their meal, and Hayes walked Beatrice back to the saloon, where she had a small room in the back. At the door, she turned to him. "Thank you for dinner," she said. "It was kind of you." "It was my pleasure," Hayes replied. "Would you like company again tomorrow? I find myself unexpectedly free, and I am a good listener." Beatrice smiled, and it transformed her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. "I would like that," she said. "Come by in the afternoon if you wish. I will be resting, but I enjoy conversation when I have the breath for it." "I will be here," Hayes promised, and he was. The next afternoon, he knocked on the door of Beatrice's room bearing a small bouquet of wildflowers he had picked on the outskirts of town. She let him in with a look of surprise and pleasure, and they spent the afternoon talking. Hayes told her about the places he had seen in his wandering, the cattle drives and mining camps and railroad towns that all blurred together in memory. Beatrice told him about the books she loved, the students who had touched her heart, the dreams she had harbored before illness drew the map of her future. The afternoon became a pattern. Hayes found work at a nearby ranch, mucking stables and mending fences, jobs that paid enough to keep him fed and housed but did not demand much of his time or attention. Every afternoon, he would visit Beatrice, bringing her flowers or interesting stones he found, or once, a beautifully bound book of fairy tales he purchased from the general store with nearly a week's wages. Beatrice treasured the book, running her trembling fingers over the embossed cover. "You should not spend your money on me," she said, but her eyes shone with tears. "I cannot think of a better use for it," Hayes replied. In the evenings, he would watch her perform in the saloon, marveling at the way she could hold a crowd spellbound even as her voice deteriorated further. She told stories of magic and adventure, of love found and lost, of heroes who were really just ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Each story seemed drawn from an inexhaustible well, and Hayes began to understand that, for Beatrice, stories were not just entertainment. They were her way of processing the world, of making meaning from suffering, of leaving something beautiful behind when she was gone. He fell in love with her slowly, and then all at once, like walking into deeper and deeper water until suddenly his feet no longer touched the bottom. He loved her courage and her honesty, her refusal to soften the hard edges of her reality. He loved the way her mind worked, making connections between disparate ideas, finding patterns in chaos. He loved her voice, damaged as it was because it was hers and because every word she spoke felt like a gift. But he did not tell her. How could he? She was dying, and the last thing she needed was the burden of his feelings. October arrived with cooler weather and the first hints of rain. Beatrice's voice grew worse. Some nights she could barely finish her stories, her words dissolving into fits of coughing that shook her whole frame. The crowd in the saloon never dwindled, though. If anything, more people came, drawn by the knowledge that they were witnessing something ephemeral and precious. One afternoon in mid-October, Hayes arrived at Beatrice's room to find her in tears. This was so unlike her that he froze in the doorway, uncertain what to do. "Beatrice," he said softly. She looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "I cannot remember it," she said, her voice breaking. "There is a story my father used to tell me about a girl who planted a garden of dreams, and I cannot remember how it ends. It is slipping away from me, Hayes. All of it is slipping away." Hayes crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside her chair. "Then tell me what you do remember," he said. "Tell me, and I will help you find the rest." Beatrice took a shuddering breath and began. The story was about a young girl who lived in a village where nothing ever grew, because the soil had been cursed by a bitter witch. But the girl had a gift for dreaming vivid, beautiful dreams, and one night a mysterious stranger told her that if she planted her dreams in the ground, they would grow into a garden that could break the curse. Beatrice got that far and then stopped, her brow furrowed in concentration. "She plants them," she murmured. "She plants her dreams and something grows, but I cannot remember what. I cannot remember how my father ended it." Hayes thought for a moment, then said, "What if the dreams grow into a tree? A single tree with branches that reach up into the sky and roots that go down into the earth. And on the tree grows every kind of fruit imaginable, fruits that taste like laughter and smell like summer rain and feel like being held when you are sad. The girl shares the fruit with her village, and as people eat it, they remember how to dream again. And when you remember how to dream, you remember how to hope, and hope breaks any curse. Beatrice stared at him. That is beautiful, she whispered. That is exactly how it should end. How did you know? I listened, Hayes said simply. I have been listening to you for weeks now, Beatrice. I know how you think. I know how your stories work, and I think maybe I have learned a little about how to tell them. Something changed in Beatrice's expression. She reached out and touched Hayes's face, her fingers cool and trembling against his cheek. You have been so kind to me, she said. Kinder than I deserve. You deserve everything, Hayes said fiercely. You deserve years and years of life and students who love you and a library full of books and gardens full of flowers. You deserve so much more than what you have been given. But this is what I have, Beatrice said. And you have made it bearable. You have made it more than bearable. You have made it sweet. They were so close that Hayes could feel her breath on his skin. He wanted to kiss her more than he had ever wanted anything, but he held back, afraid of overstepping, afraid of adding to her burdens. It was Beatrice who closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that tasted like tea and tears and something indefinably precious. Hayes wrapped his arms around her carefully, as if she were made of glass, and kissed her back with all the tenderness he possessed. When they broke apart, Beatrice was crying again, but this time she was smiling too. I did not think I would feel this again, she said. I did not think there was time. There is time for this, Hayes said. There is always time for this. That night, Beatrice's performance was different. She told a new story, one Hayes had never heard before. It was about a wanderer who came to a town and found a woman who was turning into starlight. She was dying, but not in the way people usually died. Instead, she was gradually transforming into something eternal, becoming part of the night sky piece by piece. The wanderer fell in love with her, even knowing that she would disappear. And when she asked him why he would love someone who was leaving, he said, "Because loving you is worth the grief of losing you. Because the time we have is more precious than the time we do not. Because you are turning into starlight, and I would rather love starlight than never love at all." In the story, the woman became a constellation, and the wanderer spent the rest of his life traveling from place to place, telling her story to anyone who would listen. And in this way, she lived forever, not in her physical form but in the tales that people told. When Beatrice finished, the saloon was utterly silent. Then someone started clapping, and the applause went on and on until Beatrice had to raise a hand for quiet. She looked directly at Hayes, and he knew that the story had been for him, about them. That night after the crowd had dispersed, Hayes and Beatrice walked out into the cool October air. The sky was clear and full of stars, more stars than Hayes could ever remember seeing. "I am afraid," Beatrice said quietly. "Of dying. Of being forgotten," she corrected. "I have all these stories inside me, and when I die, they will die too. I will leave no mark on the world. It will be as if I never existed." Hayes took her hand. "That is not true," he said. "You have touched every person who has heard you speak. You have changed me, Beatrice. You have given me purpose and shown me what it means to be brave. Your stories will live in the people who heard them. That is immortality of a kind." "It is not enough," Beatrice said, and her voice broke. "I have so many more stories to tell." An idea began to form in Hayes's mind, fragile and uncertain. "What if I wrote them down?" he said. "You tell them to me and I write them down. I have decent handwriting and I am a fast writer. We could save them, Beatrice. We could save your stories." Beatrice turned to him with an expression of desperate hope. "You would do that? Even after I am gone, you would keep them safe?" "I would," Hayes promised. "I will write down every story you tell me, and I will make sure they are shared. I will become your voice when you no longer have one." Beatrice started crying in earnest then, and Hayes held her under the stars, feeling her shake with sobs and exhaustion. But when she finally pulled away, she looked lighter somehow, as if a burden had been lifted. They began the next day. Hayes purchased a stack of notebooks and a box of pencils from the general store, spending the last of his savings without hesitation. Beatrice sat in her room and told him stories, pausing frequently to catch her breath or sip water or simply rest. Hayes wrote furiously, his hand cramping from the effort, determined to capture every word. She told him stories about talking animals and enchanted forests, about brave children and foolish kings, about lovers separated by fate and reunited by courage. She told him the stories her father had told her and the stories she had created herself. She told him the story of her life, the small moments and the large ones, the joys and the sorrows. As Beatrice's voice weakened, Hayes found himself filling in more and more of the gaps. She would start a story and then trail off, her energy spent, and Hayes would finish it based on what he had learned from her, the patterns and rhythms that governed her narratives. Sometimes she would nod in approval. Sometimes she would shake her head and whisper corrections. Together, they created a complete tapestry of tales, a collaboration between a dying storyteller and a wandering cowboy who had finally found a reason to stay. November came, and with it the rain. Beatrice stopped performing in the saloon. She no longer had the strength to stand for that long or to project her voice to a crowd. Instead, her audience shrank to one. Hayes, sitting beside her bed, writing down her words. The doctor came and shook his head and said there was nothing more he could do. Beatrice did not seem surprised. She had known from the beginning how this would end. On a particularly cold morning when rain drummed against the window and the world outside seemed gray and formless, Beatrice reached for Hayes's hand. "I want to tell you one last story," she said, her voice barely audible. Hayes picked up his pencil, but Beatrice shook her head. "No writing this time, just listening. This one is just for you." Hayes set the pencil down and took her hand, holding it gently. Beatrice closed her eyes and began. Once upon a time, there was a woman who thought she understood her story. She thought it would be about teaching and books, and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. But then her story changed. It became about sickness and dying and trying to hold onto something beautiful as it slipped through her fingers. She was angry about this. She felt betrayed by the universe, as if she had been promised one story and given another. She paused to catch her breath, and Hayes waited, his heart breaking. But then a wanderer came into her story, Beatrice continued. He was lost and lonely, searching for something he could not name. And somehow, impossibly, they fit together. The woman who was dying and the man who was lost found in each other a kind of completion. Her story did not become about sickness anymore. It became about love. And the wanderer's story stopped being about searching. It became about finding. Tears were streaming down Hayes's face, but he made no move to wipe them away. "The woman wanted to tell the wanderer something very important," Beatrice said. She wanted him to know that he had given her more than he could possibly understand. He had taken her final chapter and made it beautiful. He had listened to her stories and become part of them. He had loved her when she thought love was no longer possible. And she wanted him to know that she loved him too, loved him with every breath she had left, loved him enough that leaving him behind was the hardest thing she had ever done. "Beatrice," Hayes said, his voice breaking. "Let me finish," she whispered. The woman wanted the wanderer to promise her something. She wanted him to promise that he would keep telling stories, her stories and his own. She wanted him to promise that he would find happiness again, that he would not spend the rest of his life grieving. She wanted him to promise that he would remember her not as someone who died, but as someone who lived fiercely and loved completely in the time she had. "I promise," Hayes said. I promise all of it." Beatrice opened her eyes and smiled at him, and in that moment she looked the way Hayes imagined she must have looked before the illness took hold, vibrant and alive and full of infinite possibility. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, for listening, for loving me, for becoming my final tale." She closed her eyes again, and her breathing became shallow and labored. Hayes sat beside her, holding her hand, whispering his love over and over like a prayer. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean, turning the dust to mud. Beatrice Walsh died as the sun was setting, her hand in Hayes's, her final breath a whisper that might have been his name or might have been nothing at all. Hayes sat with her for a long time after, memorizing her face, saying goodbye to the woman who had changed everything. The funeral was held 2 days later. The whole town turned out, people who had listened to Beatrice's stories and people who had only heard of her. They buried her in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking Reading, under an oak tree that was already beginning to lose its leaves for winter. Hayes stood at the graveside long after everyone else had left, staring at the fresh turned earth. He felt hollowed out, as if everything inside him had been scooped away, leaving only a shell. But he had made a promise, and Hayes Ryder kept his promises. He returned to Beatrice's room and gathered all the notebooks he had filled with her stories. There were dozens of them, hundreds of pages of tales and histories and memories. He packed them carefully in his saddlebag along with his few belongings and prepared to leave Reading. But where would he go? For the first time in his wandering life, Hayes had no destination in mind. He stood in the middle of the room where Beatrice had lived and died, and he felt utterly lost. Then his eye fell on the book of fairy tales he had given her, still sitting on the small table beside the bed. He picked it up and opened it to the first page where he had inscribed a message. "For Beatrice, who taught me that stories matter," and suddenly Hayes knew what he had to do. He would go from town to town, just as Beatrice had done. But instead of staying in one place, he would travel. He would tell Beatrice's stories to anyone who would listen. He would keep her voice alive in the world, even though her physical voice had been silenced. He would become a storyteller. The idea terrified him. Hayes had never been a performer or a public speaker. He was a cowboy, more comfortable with horses than with people, better at silence than at words. But he had made a promise, and love demanded courage. He started small. That first night, he went to the Golden Prospect and asked the owner if he could speak. The owner, who had loved Beatrice's performances, agreed immediately. Hayes stood where Beatrice had stood, looked out at the crowd of familiar faces, and felt his throat close with panic. Then he thought of Beatrice, the way she had continued telling stories even when speaking hurt, even when her voice was failing, even when she knew she was dying. If she could be that brave, so could he. "My name is Hayes Ryder," he began, his voice rough and uncertain. "Some of you may have seen me here listening to Beatrice Walsh tell her stories. Beatrice died 2 days ago, and the world is dimmer for her loss. But before she died, she and I worked to write down her stories so they would not be lost. Tonight, I want to share one of those stories with you." It was one of her favorites. He told the story of the wandering knight and the tower made of starlight, the same story Beatrice had told on his second night in Reading. Hayes stumbled over some of the words and forgot parts and had to consult the notebook he had brought with him. But he got through it, and when he finished, the applause was warm and genuine. Afterward, an older woman approached him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "I was here the night Beatrice first told that story. You did it justice. You kept her spirit alive." Hayes felt something loosen in his chest. Maybe he could do this. Maybe he could keep his promise. He spent another 2 weeks in Reading, telling Beatrice's stories every night in the saloon. With each telling, he got a little better, a little more confident. He began to understand the rhythm of storytelling, the way to modulate his voice for emphasis, the importance of pauses and timing. He would never have Beatrice's gift, but he could be competent. He could be good enough. When he finally left Reading in late November, Hayes carried with him not just the notebooks full of stories, but a sense of purpose he had never felt before. He traveled south through California, stopping in small towns and mining camps, telling stories in saloons and public houses, and once, memorably, in a church basement to a group of children and their mothers. He told people about Beatrice, about the woman who had lost her voice but refused to let her stories die with her. He told them about her courage and her passion, and her belief that stories mattered. And in telling her story, he found that his own grief began to transform into something else, something that felt almost like hope. The months passed. Hayes wandered through California and into Nevada, then down into Arizona territory. He took odd jobs to pay his way, working ranches and farms, but his real work was done in the evenings when he would stand before crowds and tell the tales that Beatrice had told him. People responded to the stories. They laughed and cried and sat in rapt attention, just as they had when Beatrice was alive. Hayes realized that she had been right. Stories were how people made sense of chaos. In a hard world full of violence and uncertainty, Beatrice's tales offered beauty and meaning and hope. As he traveled, Hayes began to add his own stories to the repertoire. He told about his wandering years, about the places he had seen and the people he had met. He told about Beatrice herself, about their afternoons together and the way she had transformed him from a lost wanderer into someone with purpose. These stories were rougher than Beatrice's polished fairy tales, more raw and real, but people seemed to appreciate them just as much. Winter turned to spring, and spring to summer. Hayes found himself in Santa Fe, New Mexico territory, performing in a theater that had once hosted opera singers and now mostly sat empty. The owner had let him use the space for free, curious about the Cowboy storyteller who had been drawing crowds in smaller venues around town. On a warm evening in June 1879, Hayes stood on that stage and told the story of the woman who turned into starlight. He had told it many times before, but tonight it felt different. Tonight, he felt Beatrice's presence so strongly it was as if she were standing beside him, her hand on his shoulder, guiding his words. He told how the wanderer had loved the woman even knowing he would lose her. He told how she had become part of the night sky, eternal and beautiful. And he told how the wanderer had spent the rest of his life sharing her story, keeping her alive in memory and in tale. When he finished, there was a long silence, and then a woman in the front row stood and began to clap. Others joined her, and soon the entire theater was on its feet, applauding not just Hayes but the woman whose stories he carried. After the performance, an elderly man approached Hayes. He was well-dressed and carried himself with the bearing of someone used to authority. "Mr. Ryder," the man said, "my name is Thomas Winters. I am a publisher from Boston, currently traveling through the territories researching a book about Western life. I have been watching you perform for the past 3 nights, and I have a proposition for you." Hayes felt a flutter of nervousness. "What kind of proposition?" "I want to publish Beatrice Walsh's stories," Winters said, "and yours as well. I want to create a book that will preserve these tales and share them with readers across the country. You have something special here, Mr. Ryder. These stories deserve to reach a wider audience." Hayes felt his heart start to pound. A book. Beatrice's stories in a book, permanent and real, available to anyone who wanted to read them. It was more than he had dared to hope for. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Yes, I want that." Beatrice would want that. They shook hands and Thomas Winters smiled. "Excellent. I will need to take your notebooks back to Boston with me to begin the editing process. Can you spare them for a few months?" The thought of being separated from the notebooks frightened Hayes. They were his last tangible connection to Beatrice, proof that she had existed and that their time together had been real. But he knew this was what she would have wanted. "You can take them," Hayes said, "but promise me you will take care of them. They are precious to me." "I give you my word," Winters said solemnly. "These stories will be treated with the respect they deserve." Hayes spent the next few weeks with Winters, working to organize the stories and provide context for them. They decided to structure the book in two parts. The first would contain Beatrice's fairy tales and the stories her father had told her, while the second would contain Hayes's own tales of his travels and his time with Beatrice. Winters wanted to call the book The Dying Storyteller, but Hayes protested. "Beatrice was more than her illness," he said firmly. "The book should celebrate her life, not her death." They settled on The Starlight Chronicles, Tales from a Wandering Heart, and Hayes felt that Beatrice would have approved. When Winters finally left Santa Fe with the notebooks carefully packed in a leather case, Hayes felt both bereft and hopeful. The stories were out of his hands now, but they would reach further than he could ever carry them on his own. He continued traveling and performing, but now he told people about the upcoming book. He encouraged them to watch for it in bookstores and to share the stories with others. Beatrice's voice would live on, not just in Hayes's retellings but in printed words that could be read and reread for generations. Months passed. Hayes returned to California, drawn by a nostalgia he could not quite name. In February of 1880, he found himself back in Reading, standing in front of the Golden Prospect and remembering the first time he had heard Beatrice speak. The owner of the saloon recognized him immediately and welcomed him warmly. "Hayes Ryder, I heard you have been telling stories all across the West, and there is talk of a book." "There is," Hayes confirmed. "It should be published within a few months." "Beatrice would be proud," the owner said. "You have kept her memory alive." That evening, Hayes performed in the Golden Prospect for the first time since Beatrice's death. The saloon was packed with people who remembered her and wanted to hear her stories again. Hayes told the tale of the girl who planted dreams, the story that he and Beatrice had reconstructed together that afternoon when she had been in tears. As he spoke, Hayes felt a strange sense of completion, as if a circle that had begun 16 months ago was finally closing. He had come to Reading a lost wanderer with no purpose. He had found love and lost it. He had discovered his calling. And now he was returning to where it all began, no longer lost but found. After the performance, Hayes walked up the hill to the cemetery. Night had fallen and the stars were brilliant overhead. He found Beatrice's grave easily, marked now by a simple headstone that read, "Beatrice Walsh, 1854–1878, storyteller and teacher. Her voice lives on." Hayes sat down beside the grave and looked up at the stars. "I kept my promise," he said aloud. "Your stories are going to be published. People all over the country will read them. You will not be forgotten, Beatrice. I swear it." He stayed there for a long time, talking to her, telling her about his travels and the people he had met, and the ways her stories had touched others. He told her that he still loved her, that he would always love her, but that he was learning to live with the grief rather than being consumed by it. "I am happy sometimes now," he said. "I think you would like that. I think you would tell me that grief and joy can exist together, that loving you does not mean I have to be sad forever. You always were wiser than me." A shooting star streaked across the sky, bright and brief and beautiful. Hayes smiled. "I see you," he whispered. When he finally left the cemetery, Hayes felt lighter than he had in months. He returned to the town and rented the same room he had stayed in when he first arrived. Tomorrow, he would move on to another town, another audience, another opportunity to share Beatrice's stories. But tonight, he would rest in the place where everything had changed. The book was published in May of 1880. Thomas Winters sent Hayes a telegram letting him know that the first printing had sold out within 2 weeks, and they were rushing to print more copies. Enclosed with the telegram was a package containing 5 copies of the book, leather-bound and beautiful, with Beatrice's name and Hayes's name both on the cover as authors. Hayes held the book in his hands and felt tears prick his eyes. It was real. Beatrice's stories were real and permanent, preserved in ink and paper, available to anyone who wanted to read them. She had feared being forgotten, but that would never happen now. Her voice would echo through the years, touching people she would never meet in places she had never been. He sent copies of the book to people who had known Beatrice, to the saloon owner in Reading and the doctor who had treated her, and the handful of students from her teaching days that he had managed to track down. And he kept one copy for himself, carrying it with him as he traveled, reading from it when he performed. The book's success changed Hayes's life in ways he had not anticipated. Suddenly, he was in demand. Theater owners and saloon keepers and community organizers wrote to him, requesting performances. He could have settled in one place and performed regularly, but Hayes found that he preferred to keep moving. There was something about the wandering life that suited him, the constant change of scenery, the new faces and new stories. But he was no longer a lost wanderer. He had purpose and direction. He was keeping Beatrice's memory alive, and in doing so, he had found meaning in his own life. Years passed. Hayes continued to travel and perform, and the Starlight Chronicles continued to sell. A second book was published, containing more of Hayes's own stories and some tales he had collected from other travelers and storytellers. Then a third book. This one focused entirely on stories from the American West, real accounts of cowboys and miners and pioneers. Hayes became something of a celebrity, written about in newspapers, and invited to perform in fancy theaters in San Francisco and Denver, and even once in New York City. But he never forgot where it all started. Every year on the anniversary of Beatrice's death, he returned to Reading and visited her grave and performed in the Golden Prospect, telling her stories to anyone who would listen. In the spring of 1885, when Hayes was 33 years old, he met a woman named Caroline Foster in a small town in Colorado. She was a schoolteacher, which felt both poignant and right, and she had read the Starlight Chronicles and loved it. They struck up a friendship that slowly deepened into something more. Hayes was terrified at first. He felt as though falling in love again would be a betrayal of Beatrice, that his heart was supposed to belong to her forever. But he could hear Beatrice's voice in his head, speaking the words she had said to him in her final story. She wanted him to promise that he would find happiness again, that he would not spend the rest of his life grieving. Hayes courted Caroline slowly and carefully, telling her everything about Beatrice and the promise he had made. Caroline understood. She did not ask him to forget his first love. She only asked him to make room in his heart for a second one. They were married in the fall of 1885, in the same church in Reading where Beatrice's funeral had been held. It felt like closing one chapter and opening another, honoring the past while embracing the future. After the ceremony, Hayes took Caroline to the cemetery and introduced her to Beatrice's grave. "She would have liked you," he told Caroline. "You have the same fierce spirit, the same love of stories and learning." Caroline took his hand. "I wish I could have known her. But I know her through her stories and through you. She lives in you, Hayes, and that is a beautiful thing." Hayes and Caroline settled in a small house in Reading. Hayes still traveled to perform, but now he had a home to return to, a place where he belonged. Caroline continued teaching, and in the evenings, they would sit together and read aloud from books, or Hayes would tell her stories, practicing new tales or refining old ones. In 1887, their first child was born, a boy they named Samuel. 2 years later, a daughter arrived and they called her Beatrice. Hayes held his daughter in his arms and felt the weight of love and memory and hope all tangled together. "I am naming her after someone very important to me," he told the baby. "Someone brave and beautiful and full of stories. I hope you will grow up to be like her." As his children grew, Hayes told them stories every night before bed, just as Beatrice's father had done for her, just as Hayes himself had once listened to Beatrice. He told them fairy tales and adventures, and the story of how their father had once been lost, until he met a woman who taught him the power of stories. "Your namesake changed my life," he told little Beatrice when she was old enough to understand. "She gave me purpose and showed me what it means to be brave, and she taught me that love is always worth the risk of loss." The years rolled on. Hayes's books continued to sell, and he became known as one of the great storytellers of the American West. But he never forgot that none of it would have been possible without Beatrice Walsh, and her dying voice, and her desperate need to share the stories that lived inside her. In 1895, on a cool autumn evening very much like the one when he had first heard Beatrice speak, Hayes stood on a stage in San Francisco before an audience of hundreds. He was 43 years old now, his dark hair beginning to gray at the temples, his face lined by years of sun and wind and laughter. "Tonight," he said, "I want to tell you a story. It is a true story, and it is the most important story I know." He told them about Beatrice. Not one of her fairy tales, but her actual story. He told them about a young schoolteacher who got sick and chose to spend her final months traveling and telling stories. He told them about a lost cowboy who found purpose by listening. He told them about love that bloomed even in the shadow of death, about promises kept and memories honored. Beatrice Walsh believed that stories were how we make sense of chaos, Hayes said. She believed that tales could comfort and inspire and teach. She believed that the stories we tell define who we are and what we leave behind. And she was right. I stand before you tonight because of her. Every story I have told, every book I have written, every life I have touched through narrative exists because a dying woman trusted me to carry her voice into the world. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. We are all storytellers in our own ways. We tell stories about ourselves and about each other. We tell stories about where we have been and where we are going. And those stories matter. They matter more than we can possibly know. So I encourage you to tell your stories, to share them, to write them down. Do not let them die with you. Let them live on the way Beatrice's stories live on. Let them be your legacy. The applause was thunderous, and Hayes felt Beatrice's presence so strongly it was as if she were standing beside him on the stage, her hand in his, her damaged voice whispering, "Thank you. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for keeping me alive." Hayes continued telling stories for many more years. He published more books, mentored young writers and performers, and built a life rich with meaning and connection. He watched his children grow up and have children of their own. He grew old with Caroline, their love deepening and maturing into something solid and enduring. But through it all, Beatrice remained a constant presence in his heart and in his work. She was the foundation upon which everything else was built, the story that had given birth to all other stories. When Hayes Ryder died in 1923 at the age of 71, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. His final words were from one of Beatrice's stories. "And so the wanderer found his rest," he whispered, "not in a place, but in the stories he had told and the love he had shared." He was buried in the Reading Cemetery next to Beatrice Walsh. On his headstone, beneath his name and dates, was carved, "He listened, he remembered, he kept his promise," and the stories lived on. The Starlight Chronicles remained in print for generations, passed down from parents to children, read aloud in schools and libraries, adapted for stage and eventually for radio and film. Beatrice Walsh's name became synonymous with the power of storytelling, with the courage to create beauty in the face of death. Hayes and Caroline's daughter Beatrice grew up to become a writer herself, publishing a biography of her father and his first love that brought their story to an even wider audience. She made sure that people understood the sacrifice and the love that had birthed the stories they cherished. In the end, Beatrice Walsh's greatest fear did not come to pass. She was not forgotten. Her voice, though stilled by illness in 1878, continued to echo through the decades, touching hearts and changing lives. She had told Hayes that she had so many stories left to tell, and through him, she had told them all. The autumn wind blew through the cemetery in Reading, rustling the leaves of the oak tree that sheltered two graves side by side. If you stood very still and listened very closely, you might have heard something on that wind, something that sounded almost like a voice telling a story, the kind of story that makes you believe in magic and love and the enduring power of the human spirit. And perhaps that is the greatest story of all, the one that Beatrice Walsh and Hayes Ryder wrote together. A story about a storyteller who was losing her voice to illness and a cowboy who listened closely and became her final tale. A tale that had no ending because true stories, the ones that matter, never really end at all. They simply transform, like a woman turning into starlight, like love persisting beyond death, like words on a page that continue to breathe and live and speak long after the voices that first spoke them have fallen silent. The story of Beatrice and Hayes became a legend in its own right, told and retold across the years, each telling adding new layers of meaning while the core remained constant. Love is worth the grief, stories matter, and listening is the greatest gift we can give to one another. In the small town of Redding, California, where it all began, there stands a library now. It was built in 1950 and named the Walsh Ryder Memorial Library, honoring both the storyteller and the cowboy who preserved her legacy. Inside the library, in a glass case in the main reading room, sit the original notebooks that Hayes filled with Beatrice's stories, their pages yellowed with age but the words still clear and strong. Children come to the library and press their faces against the glass, looking at the evidence of a love story that changed the world in small but significant ways. Teachers bring their classes to learn about the importance of preserving stories and honoring those who came before. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the library is nearly empty, the librarians swear they can hear the sound of a voice, soft and raspy and infinitely gentle, telling a story about a wandering knight or a girl who planted dreams or a woman who turned into starlight. The story is always different, but the feeling it evokes is always the same. Wonder and sadness and hope all tangled together, the understanding that beauty and loss are inseparable, that loving fully means risking deeply, and that in the end, the stories we tell and the love we share are all that really matter. Beatrice Walsh had been afraid of leaving no mark on the world, of being forgotten when her voice finally failed. But she had underestimated the power of connection, the way one life can ripple outward and touch others in ways impossible to predict or measure. She had touched Hayes Ryder, and through him, she had touched millions. Her stories had comforted the grieving and inspired the lost. They had taught children to dream and reminded adults that magic was still possible. They had shown people that even in the face of death and illness and suffering, there was still room for beauty and meaning and love. That was Beatrice Walsh's legacy, not her illness or her death, but the fierce way she had lived and the stories she had left behind. And Hayes Ryder's legacy was the promise he had kept, the way he had taken a dying woman's desperate wish and transformed it into something eternal. Together, they had proven that love could transcend death, that stories could outlive their tellers, and that a single autumn evening in a small California town could change the course of countless lives. The wind continued to blow through the cemetery, and the stars continued to shine overhead, and somewhere in the infinite space between earth and sky, perhaps two souls were together again, telling each other stories that would never end. And if you listened very closely, with the kind of attention that Hayes had given to Beatrice all those years ago, you might hear the most important story of all, the one that every heart needs to hear. You are not alone. Your stories matter. Love is always worth the risk. And in the end, we live on in the hearts and memories and stories of those who love us. That was the truth that Beatrice Walsh had discovered in her final months, the truth that Hayes Ryder had spent his life sharing with the world. It was a truth as old as humanity and as fresh as each new day, a truth that would continue to resonate as long as there were people to tell stories and people to listen to them. The story of the storyteller and the cowboy had ended, but it had also just begun, because every person who read their story or heard their tales became part of the narrative, carrying it forward into the future, keeping the voices alive, ensuring that Beatrice and Hayes would never truly be gone. And that, in the end, was the greatest story ever told.